Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this month's virtual associates meeting with SIEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. I'm Mark Duggan, the director of SIEPR, and it's an honor to be hosting today's event featuring Austan Goolsbee and Kevin Hassett. Before I move on to introducing Austan, Kevin, and our moderator, Gopi Shah Goda, I want to thank you all for tuning in today and for your ongoing support of SIEPR. We've had a really terrific turnout and participation during our online events in the last several months, and I'm looking forward to hopefully keeping all of you closely engaged with us in the months ahead as we continue to hold these virtual gatherings. And those months ahead are certainly going to be very interesting. We're just 7 weeks away from Election Day today, and with the presidential campaigns in full swing, it's a tremendous honor to have two people who are so familiar with the economic policy ideas of Joe Biden and Donald Trump join us today for a conversation. SIEPR is completely nonpartisan and is an academic institute at Stanford University. So I want to be very clear from the outset that we are not favoring one candidate or campaign over the other. And I'm even going to introduce our two guests in alphabetical order to avoid any semblance of favoritism. Both of them and our moderator are all hugely accomplished, and I can only really scratch the surface of their previous experience and professional honors over these next 2 or 3 minutes that I've been budgeted so that we can get to our discussion. Austan Goolsbee served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration. He also serves on the economic advisory panel to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and has previously served on the panel of economic advisors to the Congressional Budget Office, the U.S. Census Advisory Commission, and as a special consultant for internet policy to the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. He is the Robert P. Gwynne Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and he's been both a Fulbright Scholar and an Alfred P. Sloan Fellow. Kevin Hassett served as a senior advisor to President Trump and served as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors during this administration. He's also worked as the research director at the American Enterprise Institute, was a senior economist at the Federal Reserve, and started his career on the faculty at Columbia Business School. Kevin was a senior advisor on Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. He has also advised the presidential campaigns of John McCain and George W. Bush. Kevin is now the vice president and managing director of the Lindsay Group, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and a CNN economics commentator. Our moderator today is Gopi Shah Goda, a senior fellow at SIEPR and also our deputy director. Gopi's research focuses on economic policy issues related to aging, retirement savings, and insurance. Gopi's work has been published in leading economics journals and has been supported by numerous outlets, including the Social Security Administration, the National Institutes on Aging, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the TIA Institute, and many others. With that, I am absolutely delighted to turn things over to Gopi Shah Goda and want to thank you all again for joining us today. Take it away, Gopi.
Thank you, Mark. I'd also like to welcome everyone out there to this special event and also to give a very big thanks to Austan and Kevin for being with us today. I think it'll be a very informative discussion. We're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so discussing a wide range of topics from COVID relief, tax policy, inequality, regulation, trade, to immigration, healthcare, and education. And I know that's a lot of ground to cover. We'll do the best we can to discuss all of these issues and also ensure that we have about 20 minutes to take questions from the audience. If you do have a question, you can submit it at any time during the event via the Ask a Live Question button in your confirmation email or by clicking the link below this video. All right, let's jump right in. So we could probably spend the entire time talking about the economics and economic policy related to COVID, but I wanted to get your thoughts on two issues in particular, economic relief and vaccine allocation. So Kevin, let's start with you. What are the right economic policies to provide relief to those whose livelihood have been adversely affected by the pandemic and stimulate the economy? How much spending should we do in the short run on COVID relief issues like extended and extra unemployment and stimulus payments?
Yeah, thanks, Gopi. And it's really a great pleasure and honor to be here. And I miss you guys. That's why I've got the the screen. It's my last trip out of my office at Hoover before I came back to the White House for COVID. That was actually the sunset that I saw as I was walking back to the apartment. I think that one of the untold stories of this year that I think is an important one is that, we live in pretty harshly partisan times. Folks get really upset with one another. We had an impeachment, for goodness sake, but then a disaster struck, a pandemic. And, Congress worked together to do a heck of a lot of stimulus in an incredibly timely fashion. I was in the outback of Australia in March when I got called back to the White House to help Secretary Mnuchin, the president, and Larry Kudlow contrive sort of stimulus to, help the economy survive the COVID problem. And I think that, at least relative to the expectations of Wall Street and the CBO and the Fed and even myself, I think that the stimulus effects so far have had a much bigger positive effect than I expected. To put it in perspective, I was on CNN, I think in March, saying that I thought the unemployment rate would probably go above 20%. I don't know if Austan thought that back then too, but even as recently as June, the CBO and the Fed both said that by the end of this year, the unemployment rate would be in the 10s or around 10, and we're way below that now. But the problem is that we really shouldn't take that success and then just sort of put it in the bank and move on to the election without doing anything else. And I think that the way to think about it is the second quarter, because of the shutdown, is basically the worst quarter in US economic history. And the third quarter is probably going to be about the best. But when all is said and done, when the dust settles, it's pretty likely that the economy will be, maybe 3 to 5% below where we started after the recovery. And if the economy dropped 5% today, then that would be a serious crisis. And so the idea that things are trajecting up does not mean that we don't have a serious policy challenge that requires a lot of action. As far as the exact scale of the measures that we need, that's something that, economic science is going to tell you precisely what we need, but we definitely need something along the scale of what we've already done, because if you go back to March, when people were advising, and I promise not to filibuster Austan, sorry, when people were advising the economists about like what kind of stimulus package we needed, that, health advisors for, Vice President Biden and for the president, the task force people were saying things like, well, the cold season usually ends when it gets warm. And so probably, and even if you looked at the forecast from IHME and others, then probably by the summer, we'll be able to really get going again with much lower cases. And so the stimulus was designed to build a bridge basically to the summer, but now the COVID cases are, higher than they were even back then. And so we need kind of like a pontoon bridge that's going out, trying to get to the other side in the fog. And that's a really big task. And I think that, the Democrats or Republicans should be commended for working together in the spring. And I think, scolded a little bit for not working well together now. And I hope and pray really that in the next few weeks, there's some news today out of Washington that maybe they're getting back to work, that we'll have a stimulus bill in the sort of, 1.5 to 2.5 trillion range.
Great. Austan, how about you? What do you think is the right mix of relief payments?
I guess I kind of agree with the closing sentiments that Kevin expressed, though, he was out in the outback. He should have stayed there. If they called him back to the White House, he should not have come. You can't even travel there now. I think that the administration's response to the COVID crisis is arguably in the top 3 worst things that the federal government has ever done. The response to that crisis is almost unprecedented in how bad it's been. And that's why I like the idea, the image that Kevin said of we got to make this pontoon bridge. And I think the in the trillions that we designed and passed rapidly, that was designed for a world, as Kevin said, where the disease was going to peak and then go down the way it did in all the other advanced economies. That wasn't factoring in that you were going to get really pretty explicit blowback from the president himself, making fun of the public health measures like wearing masks or socially distancing, and that there would be this whole amplification. that would make this thing not go away. If it's not going away, then we're going to have to keep propping up the economy along the same lines and order of magnitude of what we did before. And the only thing I would add to that is, I don't even consider that stimulus. We keep calling that a stimulus bill. It's not stimulus. Stimulus of the form, we're going to do this to try to get the GDP to grow faster. I think this is mostly just trying to keep warm by burning money while the furnace is out. And that works only as long as you keep throwing money in to burn. And if we can't stop the spread of the virus, I think it's unlimited how much that's going to cost.
Austin, would you be in favor of additional aid to state and local governments? And if so, how would this aid best be allocated? By population, the extent of the shock, or something else?
Yeah, but look, 100% I'd be in favor of that. I think if you take a step back and just think philosophically, why is there federal debt and state government debt separately? The state government debts, each state is, there, if you're an economist, you're thinking of some T-Boo model, and each state is choosing their own type of stuff. But the federal government's borrowing rate is much lower than the states. And for national shocks that are temporary and unpredicted, it's totally obvious that that's a thing that would be the optimal way to deal with that, is to confront it, put it on the federal balance sheet, not on the state balance sheets. So I have been saying for months that to not do that threatens one of the big speed bumps that could face our recovery. Hope we would have a quick recovery. The first speed bump is, if we don't try to help the states and they have these balanced budget requirements, they're going to have to raise taxes and lay off millions more workers. And the second speed bump, which I'm sure we'll get to, is the PPP money and the other rescue money for companies is going to run out. And when it runs out, they're going to be faced with laying off millions more workers. So I think, however maybe you allocate it by population, maybe you allocate it by, it's an interesting idea, should you allocate it by the number of cases? If you're going to start going down a health-based determination, then you're going to get into this thing of, well, should it be the cumulative, so that a state like New York that had a huge peak but is now way down, or Connecticut gets more? Or should it be about current cases? If your current caseload is high, then you get more. Probably, I think the easiest is to go by some population-based measure, but I'm not sure. I know that we've already lost almost 1.5 million state workers, and at least as many as that are going to be on the hook if we don't do this.
Great. Kevin, how about you? What do you feel about the aid to state and local governments as part of the package?
Well, one thing that was kind of like a footnote in all the stuff that was done before Austin is that they do reimburse for Medicare and Medicaid a heck of a lot more if it's a COVID patient. And so they're going after a little bit of that effect that you mentioned. And, I also think that Austin, you took it a little off the rails when you started attacking the COVID thing. This is not a seminar about that. We should probably invite my colleague Scott Atlas to come debate you about that. But I'm not going to pick that one up. I'm going to stay back on the tracks. And the final thing is that in terms of state and local aid, that there are some states that are in pretty good shape, that had rainy day funds, that took risks and opened their economy and required masks and didn't have cases run out of control. And then there are other states that entered the year pretty much close to default. And of course, state and local aid is important, but the question is sort of, what should it be? And when I was still in the White House, one way we thought about answering that question is we looked at what the projections were for this year for GDP, and then looked at the correlation of state and local revenues with GDP growth, and then estimated how much the shortfall would be for state and local governments. And basically that estimate that we had, and I think the CBO probably has something fairly similar, was about 1/3 of the ask that the Democrats have had. And so what's going on is that there's like a political fight that, because there's a need for stimulus, that folks from the blue states that have had fiscal problems for a long time are trying to use the stimulus to sort of bail out things that aren't COVID related. And that caused a real sort of political breakdown in July and August, but that's where it came from. But I don't think there's anyone who thinks there shouldn't be state and local aid. I think the point is that it should be enough to sort of fill the hole of this year, because it's certainly not the state's fault that COVID came to America.
The only thing I would say to that is there are a great number of people who are opposing state and local aid in every form. Kevin's not, because he's coming at it from a sensible way. And
but
look,
the White
he
House
and I
is
can
not
debate
either.
the details of that's a question of what should the formulation, should it be based on projected, here's what happened to your GDP, therefore here's what the implied cost should be. That'd be fine. We can debate what the funding formula should be.
Mhm.
If you look at Mitch McConnell in the Senate, it is definitely not a studiously determined formulaic approach. Yes, we should have relief. It's just a question of determining how much. It's absolutely opposed to providing money to blue states, and I think that's problematic.
Let me just say, so I've been out of the White House for a little more than a month, but I was in the Senate Finance Committee room negotiating the Phase 3 deal right after I got back from Australia. And, the fact is that the last time I was paying attention to the negotiations in June, the Republicans had on the table, a lot more money than my estimate of the shortfall. And so it could be that their position has changed since I was in there. But I think that your characterization isn't correct, that they're definitely willing to put some money, extra money. There's been a heck of a lot of money delivered already too. Like it depends on whether you count the lending programs, but 2 to 500 billion, something like that.
Let's move on to a different question. That is another place where I think economics can help us think through what are effective policies, and that is vaccine allocation. So suppose for a minute that there's scientific consensus that a vaccine is available that's both safe and effective. What economic policies could get a vaccine out in the most efficient way possible? Austan, do you want to start?
I hesitate to get into speculative. I mean, this is almost literally like, let's assume we have not just one can opener. Let's assume we have the greatest of all can openers. How will we decide who gets to open their soup first? I mean, I feel like you probably don't want to primarily use the price system to allocate the vaccines. I think if you were thinking about some social planner, you'd want the vaccines to go to the most at-risk people. So you would start with the frontline healthcare workers. You would move to people who have a higher danger of infecting others, where they're interacting with lots of people, that they would go second, and people who are most at risk that the disease would really harm them. I think we're running into this thing that in the US, because pre-existing conditions that make you at risk for greater health problems from COVID include obesity, previous heart disease, as well as age and other pre-existing conditions. You've got arguably 40 to 60% of the population in a category that catching COVID would be of high risk to them. So I think this idea put forward by economists and business people, and to their credit, has been somewhat pursued thus far in the Trump administration, of let's try to build up production capacity for vaccines before the vaccines are even approved. I think that's a good idea. But I hope we can get ourselves in a mindset that the vaccine is not the only answer. If you look at other countries where they have gotten control of the spread of the virus, there's still no vaccine in Korea. There's no vaccine in Germany. There's no vaccine in Australia, but they've taken actions that reduce the reproduction rate of the virus, and they slowed the spread of it. And you can stop pandemics even without a vaccine.
Kevin, what would you like to add?
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks. And I think Austan would agree that Austan, even to go back to sort of inside baseball from the spring, it's not just vaccines. There's so many things like this that you sort of recognize that if one of the first days on the job I got there, and that there were estimates that we were going to be like 40,000 ventilators short the next week or two. And then we started working with auto companies and others to try to increase ventilator production. And then we kind of recognized that if you want sort of 10,000 ventilators by the summer, you have to like give them the incentive to build the factory, and you got to buy like a heck of a lot of ventilators. And so you got to really like guarantee demand to encourage the private sector to build enough of the things. And the ventilator was one success story, and I think the vaccine is another, in the sense that the government has just pre-bought billions of vaccines as soon as one is accepted, and that's going to be an important part of safely giving us herd immunity. The thing about vaccines, though, is that they're really, really hard to test and develop for lots of reasons. And you've noticed that one of the Oxford one, ran into a problem that I think that the idea that the vaccine is going to be here really, really soon is one that we can hope is true, but it's probably going to take longer than you might think, because it's just so hard to develop a vaccine. And as Austan said, that there are a lot of other things that we could be doing, and that frankly, the administration has worked very hard on, which is getting a heck of a lot more testing. And there's a lot of very good news in the testing front, where people are developing antigen tests that go on paper that can be used as a point of care test, or even at home, and not approved by the FDA yet for home. But these tests are really pretty easy to use. Even a dork like me could do it. And so if you could get those tests at home, then it could be a game changer before there's a vaccine, because people could test themselves, and if they test negative, go to work. If they test positive, stay home. And even, the pharmaceutical companies have apps where they can sort of register the test on your phone, so your phone can tell other people that you're okay. And so I think that the next step, probably before the vaccine, is a massive increase in testing. And with that, the government has already agreed to buy something like 150 million, I believe, of those paper tests, and expect to get a big chunk of those starting at the end of this month. And so I think that that's really the next phase, is the radical increase in the availability of testing is going to help us sort of move further ahead in the curve before there's a vaccine.
I totally agree with that. I think that's tremendously important. I mean, even if you look down at the University of Illinois, I'm in Chicago, down at the University of Illinois, they had a lot of tests, but they've had even more parties than they've had tests. And so that's been a big problem. If we had the kind of tests that Kevin talked about, that you could envision, who would care if they were throwing parties? If it was like, to get in the party, you got to take a test, and then they say, all right, you can go in and you can't. I think the sentiment coming from the president on testing, of clearly being of at best two minds on it, and saying, oh, we don't want to do tests and we don't want to report results from people who are asymptomatic. If we had fewer tests, then there would be fewer documented cases. I think that's dangerous. That goes against what the insight that Kevin had there, which is, if you don't have a vaccine, more tests in a way are a substitute for the vaccine, or they're a bridge till you get a vaccine. And so I hope that they will bring that, the
Right.
Hassett attitude, not the Navarro.
No, but Austin, I mean, it is the president that signed off on buying the 150 million tests, right?
Okay, that's why I felt like I was being generous to say that he's of two minds on it. And so maybe there are some pieces of evidence where he's promoting tests. I hope that we get more in that space.
Yeah. Let's move on to a few different topics. So next, I want to talk a little bit about tax policy and deficits and spending. So it seems pretty clear there's a large difference in proposed policy moving forward between the two candidates on taxes. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said that one of the key differences between Trump and Biden on taxes is that Biden wants to raise capital gains taxes while Trump wants to lower them. Biden has also stated he would raise individual tax rates for high earners. How would these tax changes impact the economy in the short and the long run? Austan, can you start by helping us think through that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say two things. We can think about the tax policy. Biden's program involves raising taxes on high income people and corporations, and using the money for things that are quite important. So I don't think that we should separate those two things out. So if I say let's raise taxes on billionaires and let's use the money so that we can provide universal child care. That's definitely pro labor market and labor force participation. And if you just look at the tax side, you say, well, how does it help that taxes go up on anybody? The answer is what they use the money for is what helps it when they do that. I think my read on George W. Bush's massive tax cut for high income people is it promised the moon. There's an old song, you promised your girl filet mignon, you took her to White Castle. And this has been the White Castle instead of filet mignon over and over again, in which they promised massive increases in growth, tax cuts that pay for themselves, a huge permanent increase in the investment rate, trickled down, wages will go up for workers. And it didn't happen with George Bush. It did not happen then when Donald Trump cuts taxes. My critique at the time of the Trump tax cut was that 90+% of it, just $2 trillion unpaid for, and 90+% of it was just going to be windfall transfer, not changing the marginal incentives. And that what would happen, and you can go back, Kevin and I debated it just as it was going in place. And I said, you're going to see a massive increase in share repurchases and dividend payouts because the barrier to investment in the United States has not been that the cost of capital is too high. So you can cut the cost of capital. Mostly what you will achieve in doing is windfall gains for the existing capital owners. And there won't be a sustained increase in investment. And there won't be a $4,000 increase to average wages, which is what they promised. And it won't pay for itself. And it didn't. And before there ever was COVID, the Trump tax cut was the most unpopular tax cut in the history of American polling. And the reason that's true is because people looked at what it did and it didn't do what they promised. So I think Joe Biden's view is return corporate taxes to something like historic norms and what exists among large economies out in the rest of the world. So return that to 28%, return high income people's tax rates to more historical rates that are higher than where they are now, and use the money to pay for things that the middle class needs, like a public option on healthcare so the people who lose their jobs don't lose their health insurance in the middle of a pandemic, like universal child care, and a bunch of the things that, in my worldview, are the things that drive growth in the country.
Thanks, Kevin. What are your thoughts about the tax policy differences between the two candidates?
Yeah, I think that, I want to bring a few facts in because I think that there's some things that Austan said that I think are not accurate. So, for example, I do remember our debate. I think it was Philadelphia, right, Austan? That was the one where we were on the stage. And, we basically, I said, based on 8 peer-reviewed papers, including one that Aparna and I wrote, that we would expect over the next 3 to 5 years to see an increase in household income of $4,000. Today, we got the census data that reports that real median income since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed increased $4,900. That's a record high. And it was actually disproportionately focused on folks at the bottom end of the income distribution. That, the growth rate for Black-headed households was 10.5%. The poverty rate dropped by 6.6 million Americans, which is the biggest drop since the war on poverty began. And, if you don't think that happened because of deregulation and tax cuts, then it'd be interesting to see what the other hypothesis might be for that. Finally, when we debated, Austan, the thing I remember making a bet about, but I don't remember the amount of money, was that I told you that income inequality was going to go down because of the tax cuts, because of the effects of wages of more capital. And in fact, the share of income of the top 20% since TICSA has dropped, and the Gini coefficient, the Gini index of inequality has dropped as well. So I sort of won that bet. You kind of implied that we were talking, that I was denying that there would be repurchases, but that's like a stock flow thing. It's a red herring. What we did is there were trillions of dollars overseas that we allowed firms to repatriate. And that's different from the sort of marginal incentive to invest. That was freeing up capital to come home and be repurchased or whatever firms wanted to do with it. And so it doesn't show that the tax cuts didn't work. On the Biden side, the characterizing it as a tax hike on billionaires, I think, is it accurate that you're proposing tax hikes for people with incomes above 400,000, and even increasing the payroll tax on people like that, which will affect, lots, probably most small business employees in the country. And so I think that tax plan is pretty harmful. And my guess is, if you look back at the Obama administration, and I give you guys great credit for this, that President Obama ran on the repeal of the Bush tax cuts, but then because the Great Recession was going and the economy was weak, then you guys decided to postpone that repeal, even for the top marginal rate, if memory serves me, for a couple of years. And so my guess is that if Vice President Biden wins, that they'll make the same decision, and he's going to run on these, tax the rich claims that maybe will get the left-wing base really excited, but then he's going to not do it. And there are even signs today, you can go and look, if you Google it in the news, that Democratic senators have begun to tell their constituents that they're going to take a close look at the economy before they vote for any tax hikes.
I mean, do we want to continue on that one, or you want to go to something else?
Well, I was going to talk about a related issue, which is deficits, but why don't we finish this conversation?
Okay, notice the internal contradiction that Kevin started by saying the economy's coming back and strong, but now it sounded like was admitting we're going to be in recession and bad at the time if Joe Biden becomes the president. The only thing I'll say about wages is I have the median household income data. In 2016, median household income rose 4.6%. In 2017, the year before the tax cuts are in practice, median income is up 4.9%. After the tax cuts are passed, median income up 3% and then 3.7%. And then there is 2020, and we'll see what happens this year. There's no evidence that there was any incremental impact of those tax cuts on wage growth. Kevin's counting $4,000 as what was already happening. If you simply extended the growth rate from 2016 before Donald Trump was in office, it would exceed by several $1,000s what actually happened in wages.
No, the Trump 3 years vastly exceeded the best 3 years for Obama. I'll send you an email about it, Austin. You're just incorrect.
Let me turn to deficits and spending, because this is all related, as Austin said. So deficits were large prior to COVID, and in 2020 are expected to triple the 2019 shortfall, according to recent projections by the Congressional Budget Office. And these same projections show federal debt held by the public rising to levels not seen since World War II as early as next year. How urgent of a problem is this? In economics, we often say there's no free lunch. And I think it's true here too. With deficits, we can either increase taxes, reduce spending, hope for growth, or not worry about it. And does either candidate have a plan to reduce the significant deficits that we face going forward, and in fact, that we faced even before COVID? Kevin, can you start with that?
Yeah, sure. And just to clarify, because Austin asserted that I was being inconsistent, but I was not, that when we're talking about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we need to look at the data pre-COVID, and that's what I was doing. Post-COVID, there are definitely economic risks that are extreme and serious, and I think that both candidates are right to focus during the campaign on their alternative visions to help us recover from this pandemic recession, which is definitely not going to be over after we post a third quarter GDP growth that's probably going to be north of 20%. And so I think that deficit reduction is a super important thing, but because interest rates are so low, the costs of those high deficits right now are certainly outweighed by the benefits of the stimulus programs that we've been pursuing. And I absolutely, in the second term, I'm sure that if we get back to a booming economy again, that people are going to have to think about deficit reduction, because we're looking at deficit rates that are headed towards things that are beyond anything in the US experience.
So what is
Look, my view is I've kind of changed my view quite substantially. When I was in the Obama administration and Republicans were hounding the Obama administration and trying to block anything it was doing and saying, but what about the deficit? At that time, I said, hey, it's a recession. That's the only reason the deficit's going up. And the the time as in kind of in Kevin's, I didn't catch his exact phrase, but it was, in boom times is when you should be thinking about that, not in the depth of a recession. I've now come to believe that it had nothing to do with the content of the statements, that the Republicans who were saying that at the time did not actually mean it, because as soon as Donald Trump took office, they immediately passed a $2 trillion unpaid for tax cut. And that was the last you ever heard about fiscal responsibility until now, when there's a Democrat leading in the polls to become the president, and you can see them already itching to just go back to the same playbook and say, oh, now we've rediscovered that the deficit is hugely important and we need to stop whatever the Democrat's going to propose. I think in the short run, I've always been of the view, there are some people who view the deficit problem as being one that the US is like Greece and that we will face some fiscal crisis where our interest rate soars. I personally find that very unlikely because the debt capacity of the United States is vastly in excess of where we are now. We start from a debt to GDP ratio well below most any of the other advanced economies. We have lower income tax rates than those countries have already. We have better demographics as long as we don't blow up immigration. But if we don't do that, we have better demographics than they have. And they already have 20% VATs, national sales taxes. So I think we are able to choose our own adventure in a way that almost no other advanced economy can. In my view, the problem of debt and deficits is not that you are going to see your interest rate go up. It's that you have to pay back the money. So you should be thinking about this question of how fair is it that tax rates on people living today would be at some level, but the tax rates on grandkids are going to have to be higher to pay for what we're doing today. But look, that's the long run fiscal position is one we should think about. It has to do with the aging of the population and how much immigration we have. I think anybody that's going to argue, let's just put it in practical terms, anybody that's going to, with a straight face, make an argument that if Joe Biden believes that we need to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, healthcare, universal childcare, et cetera, that is threatening the fiscal health of the country, I think you kind of have to explain how George Bush cut taxes by $2 trillion for high income people. We fought 2 wars, cost of $1.5 to $2 trillion, also unpaid for. Donald Trump cuts taxes, $2 trillion unpaid for. We've got $3 trillion COVID relief unpaid for. None of those things drive up the interest rate. It's clear that some things are investments and some things are giveaways. In my view, is the investment things. We should not be thinking about them in the context of the deficit.
Well, thinking more about investments, I know we're all familiar with the recent research that has shown that today's children's chances of out-earning their parents have declined from children born in the 1940s. And what are the economic proposals from each candidate to empower lower income households to move up? Austan, can you speak to that first?
Yeah, and I would encourage everybody who's interested in that to go read the fact sheets from the Build Back Better plan. There's one central component is about education, training, investing in the workforce, and investing in the care economy so that moms and dads can go back to work and not be nervous about how their kids are being taken care of. One component is about worker bargaining power, and there's been a huge rise of corporate power, and in the economist language, rise of monopsony. So I think that's a component. And there is a component that is about racial inequality and trying to close those racial gaps that have existed in the economy. And the fourth is ultimately you've got to create a path to jobs in new industries if you want people's incomes to go up. So it's trying to do that.
Kevin, are there Trump policies that are also designed to help the inequality that we see right now?
Yeah, that's right. And I should start by talking about how many things that have already been done. So for example, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, one of the top priorities for everybody in the White House was the opportunity zone, the establishment of opportunity zones. And those of the CEA just put out a study on these. Those have been remarkably successful at moving capital into distressed communities that, of course, disproportionately affect minorities. They disproportionately live in distressed communities. And getting all that money into those distressed communities is going to support a lot of jobs, provide tax revenue to improve schools, and so on. And continuing to accelerate that policy is a key objective of the president. And I know that there are many in the Democratic Party, because they seem to just dislike anything that has Trump's name associated with it, that have talked about repealing that policy. I think that'd be extremely unfortunate. The other thing that we focused on while I was in the White House was prison reform, and basically making it so that grants could be used for training and community college for prisoners. And I set up, or our team set up a monitoring system for that. And as of yesterday, about 35,000 people have received these grants in prison. And of course, how the president let nonviolent passed a law to help nonviolent people get out of prison. And of those 35,000 or so who got grants, 18,500 of them are employed. And so I think that the problem of helping folks in the most distressed places is a complicated one, and it requires policies like that, and we expect to continue to innovate on that if it's possible. The thing that I'm most concerned about is just that I think that competition between schools is very important for determining the quality of schools. And I'd be very distressed if, for example, all the charter schools in DC, which are really successful and really popular with minorities, were shut down because the teachers unions want to do that. And that's another thing that I've seen, risk of that sort of rise to my attention as I watch the rhetoric in the campaign.
All right, well, let's turn to another topic, which is regulation. I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on the importance of consumer protection by the federal government for a successful economy. And, for those of us on the West Coast, the devastation from the current raging wildfires is putting climate change at the forefront of people's minds. How should we think about the trade-offs of environmental regulation, incorporating the social cost of carbon and its effect on economic activity? Kevin, would you like to start?
I think it's my turn. I think I've been free riding on Austin a little bit. Again at CEA, we put out a huge report and included a couple of chapters in the economic report of the president on President Trump's deregulatory effort, which I hope Vice President Biden, if elected, that he would continue to follow some of those procedures, because what the president did is he basically gave a regulatory budget to everybody. And so if you find a new regulation that you think, passes the cost benefit test is important to pass, then you got to find something else that doesn't and eliminate that. And so on net, at the beginning, regulations were actually declining rather than increasing for the first time that I can remember. And there are a lot of subtle little things that were going on when we really dug into the way regulation was, exploding in America. And again, not just in the Obama administration, but here's like a little weird example that if there's a regulation that the government has to spend, say, $1 billion to enforce, then under the old rules, that $1 billion cost to the government of enforcing didn't count as cost of the regulation in the cost benefit analysis, because the cost benefit green eye shades assumed that it was just, they would just tax somebody the $1 billion and it's a transfer from one part of the US to the other. And so therefore it's not a net cost. But of course, economists know that if you raise $1 billion, then there's a marginal cost of that $1 billion. And the literature suggests that it's probably about $500 million. And so if you're doing a cost benefit analysis of a regulation, you should include the cost of the funds if funds are necessary. And that's the kind of like down in the weeds reform that we engaged in when we were in the White House. And I think that we did a lot of good. And as for climate change, Austin knows this. I think we started communicating when he was still in grad school, but I've been writing about carbon taxes since the early 90s. And I think that one of the things, great disappointments for me, is that there are ways to recycle carbon tax revenue so that even if you didn't believe in climate change, you could make the economy better off, or at least not worse off. And it's unfortunate that people who believe strongly in it and people who don't haven't been able to sort of seek that type of alternative, which would be a reasonable compromise.
I guess I kind of feel about this as many things. When I talk to Kevin, I think, here's a sensible guy. And if I sat down with Kevin, we could figure out in a whole bunch of areas productive ways to tweak the existing regulatory environment. And then I look at the Trump administration, where the process is not being driven along the optimization lines that Kevin's describing. And I see systematic trying to downgrade the value of benefits that are of public safety and health. So you'll see the Mercury rules. There are a number of rules that the Obama administration put in, and they did legitimate cost benefit analysis of. And because of the health benefits to children, they got rid of dumping mercury in the groundwater. And one of the first things that the Trump administration does is say, but that harms coal-fired power plants, so we're going to just let them go back and do that. And we're not going to count the benefits, which the literature documents on future health and future earnings. We're just not going to count those as benefits. I think that's really dangerous. Then there's a second category of regulations where I don't see how you could view it as anything other than the administration actively flouting the law. So when they passed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it specifically says what the agency is tasked to do. And they put in charge of the CFPB people who explicitly do the opposite of the intention of the law. So their view is, it doesn't matter if the law says that the following should be regulated, or that they should protect against payday loans, or that mortgages should not be abusive in the following ways. We're just simply not going to allocate money for enforcement, or we're going to say that the goal of the organization is the exact opposite of the stated goal of the organization. I think both of those are terribly dangerous. They're dangerous on the face, that they get the regulation decisions wrong on the margin. And I think there are numerous examples where they have done so. But I think to the broader point of undermining confidence in the entire apparatus of the operation of government in the environmental space, in the consumer protection space, and financial regulation space, I think those are really quite fundamental issues. And it makes me nervous if we continue down that path.
Let me ask you both about trade. So here's an area where most economists think that freer trade is generally better, but we've seen a lot of resistance to trade deals from both candidates. And can you explain what we should look forward to in terms of trade with China specifically and the rest of the world more generally?
Can I go first on that one? Because
yeah,
I
sure.
have a funny story that I think the person who really taught me how to think about this was Austan. And Austan, I don't know if you remember, but I think we were doing an event like this at some point. It was some previous presidential campaign, maybe President Obama's first time. And then I think I attacked President Obama for being kind of sour on NAFTA. And then you said, well, actually, you know, economists don't understand what trade deals look like. An economist trade deal is like one line, free trade, but the trade deals are thousands and thousands of lines. And if you look at those lines, then you can find a lot of stuff that's ugly that needs to be fixed. But I don't mean to paraphrase you in front of an audience, Austan, but I think that was an extremely interesting thing for you to say. And I hope it wasn't just private and you hoped I didn't say it, but it really informed what I saw happening when we were in the Trump White House and we started to dig into the details of the trade deals and see how much stuff that we had conceded in the past, and it's not just President Obama, that was really bad for American businesses. And so I think that trade deals probably historically were asymmetric in the disfavor of the US because we were competing with the Soviet Union with our umbrellas for influence over other countries. And we gave them access to our markets kind of unilaterally. And so we ended up with really asymmetric trade deals, both in the parameters and in the details. And that was my very first trade chapter of the economic report of the president, is documenting that. And so I think that working to improve the asymmetries of the trade deals is something that's very important regardless of who's president.
Look, I do remember saying that. I said, you know, our ideas as economists, we're all for free trade. That's kind of our professional badge. But if you look at the actual trade deals, they look like the tax code. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is it's not the details that are in them that I objected to. They're not things that are bad for America. In fact, they're very few of those. What they are carve-outs for usually powerful industries in America. Or, you know, if we're gonna go negotiate some trade deal, there's a special treatment of pharmaceuticals that they want to receive pharmaceutical drug pricing from other countries as if it were at U.S. prices, for example. And there'll be a whole bunch of things like that. I think we're the wrong people in a sense to ask, because we both have PhDs in economics. So you're never going to hear, nobody's going to out free trade us. At the same time, I don't understand the Trump approach, which is muscular declaration of trade war, threatening of trade war of our allies as well as our adversaries over and over and over. So we've threatened trade wars with Canada, with Mexico, with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Germany, with the EU, with Australia, threatened China again, threatened Mexico again, threatened the EU again, done a trade war with China, and then reached a deal which we didn't, the Chinese have not abided by the supposed New Deal that they signed in the first stage. I don't understand that approach. If you want to change China's behavior, we have succeeded in the past at doing that. We got China to stop devaluing their currency, for example. The way you do it is you get all your allies on the same page. You go to China, and not in public. You don't try to humiliate them. You say, look, if you don't do this, then all of us together are going to do X, Y, Z. The Trump approach was promised that it was going to have huge payoffs to the US, that we were going to threaten to blow up the world trading system. And that, yes, he seems like a madman, but he's a madman who's a genius because this is going to get us concessions. Didn't get us any concessions. These aren't concessions. Even the USMCA, which I think is an improvement over NAFTA, 95% of it is simply taking provisions that were in the TPP that the nations had already agreed to and saying, hey, how about we call that the new NAFTA? And the Canada and Mexico said, sure, we already agreed to that stuff. So I think constant tariffs took real damage on US manufacturing and on US agriculture. Continue to do so, as evidenced by the US is putting agriculture on the welfare payroll, paying them $30 billion to make up for the damage that they did in the trade war. Manufacturing was already in recession by the end of 2019 before COVID ever arrived, again, because of trade war. So I think if Donald Trump is reelected, absolutely you can expect that we're going to go back into this environment of threat and war, because he's decided that's one of the things that he can do without congressional approval.
Can I just respond for 30 seconds? I just want to say that, of course, I agree with Austin that we both recognize the benefits of free trade. And, President Trump, even at the G7 meeting, said that he would be happy to go to zero tariffs and zero non-tariff barriers with everyone. The fact is that we carefully documented in the economic report of the president these asymmetries that I'm talking about. And a lot of them, they're things like auto regs that make it so that our auto manufacturers can't sell cars in the countries and so on. And there's been a lot of progress made on that. There's been a lot of progress in NATO with European countries actually starting to pony up the cash that they've committed to spend on defense and so on. And so, being really sweet and nice with our allies is maybe it's a great feel-good thing for a person to do, but decades of that led to us inheriting this system that was profoundly asymmetric. And President Trump tried a different approach and has had quite a lot of progress to report. And I don't know what your evidence is about the Chinese not adhering to the deal, because I check it closely and everyone's saying that they are.
They're 50% below the targets of the purchases of American products that they promised by this point. Literally half. They're nowhere near where they're supposed to be.
So there is a plea among the audience members actually for both of you to share your data sources, because I think a lot of these things are things that we can all look up as citizens and kind of have a way to monitor on our own.
Happy to, yeah. I'll give it to you if you guys can post it at SIEPR.
Great. I'll just ask one last question before I turn to the questions from the audience, and that's about immigration. So immigration is in a way, it's like trade, but rather than goods crossing borders, we're talking about people. And there's very different views regarding the role of immigrants in the economy, with one being that immigration increases labor market competition and reduces wages and increases unemployment of native-born workers, while the other being that immigration is an engine of economic growth and prosperity. What is an appropriate immigration policy that increases production and doesn't threaten US jobs? And are there other economic policies that should complement immigration reform? Kevin, would you like to start?
Oh, sure, I can go. No, in fact, since we're running out of time and want to go to questions, I could just say that while I was in the White House, Jared Kushner set up a group where we developed a legal immigration reform. And I think that we did an enormous deep dive into the immigration literature and came up with a system for the US that looks quite a bit like that in Australia, actually. And I can remember going over and meeting with the Washington Post editorial board and talking about it. And of course, in this heated political climate, that bill really didn't make any progress. But I think that if one wants to see like what I think a solid, sound immigration reform would look like, they should go back and look that up on the internet.
Look, I think the economic evidence is overwhelmingly clear that the net positive of immigration is one of the biggest net positives of anything, that the demographics of the native-born population of the United States looks just like Japan and Western Europe, that without robust immigration, all of our social safety net is really under great threat because of the baby boom and the prime age, the gap in the prime age working population. And here again, we can argue about, do you think that for the type of immigration, we'd be better off with a point system and skill-based immigration versus family-based immigration that we have had historically? We can have all of those intricate policy debates. That's not what the administration is doing. And everyone knows that. They're actively hostile to immigration. The president is, from the highest level, says really inflammatory, derogatory things about immigrants. And they have actively tried to block legal immigration and high skill immigration, cutting it in half, proposing to cut it in half and more. And I think it's a terrible mistake. I think it's a terrible mistake. You saw them attempt to block in the COVID times foreign students, and the uproar was so great that they backed away from that. But that Stephen Miller kind of attitude that let's take children from their parents and put them in cages, or now you saw the reports from the whistleblowers yesterday that they're forcing sterilization on women who are trying to immigrate into the United States illegally. This is not the American way. This is not recognizable. It's culturally awful. It's economically, if anything, even worse if we're going to limit immigration to that strenuously.
Austin, I have a question from the audience, specifically for you, but Kevin, you might want to weigh in as well. Under a Biden administration, business leaders are worried that if the Democrats hold a Senate majority, the progressive wing will enact confiscatory tax measures and enact significant anti-business legislation. Do you agree with that characterization? How would you?
I don't agree with that characterization. I have a PhD in economics. So if you're asking my political advice, something's wrong with you. Well, like, what do I know about that? The only thing I will say is Joe Biden has proposed, it's right on his webpage. You can look at what his corporate tax plan is. He does propose to raise corporate taxes back to 28%, which is a perfectly viable global-wide large economy rate. He's proposed cracking down on a bunch of what he views as tax shelters and tax avoidance schemes. And if you think that that's anti-business, I guess I would just encourage you to think more broadly about the greater good than just what the tax bill is for that one corporation. I don't consider a corporate tax rate of 28% to be socialism. I don't consider that to be a breakdown of the capitalist system or anything of the sort. I think what Joe Biden has outlined is sensible, and we went too far in the previous iteration in windfall gains to big corporations.
Kevin, what is your view on kind of the role of?
Yeah, I think that Austin's correct that going to 28%, I view it as harmful, but it's not socialism. The thing that gives me a lot more pause is the massive unprecedented tax increase on pass-through entities. And that's something that I think would be extraordinarily harmful. And I hope that if they get the White House, that they decide not to do it, because they just look at the huge change in incentives and understand that as economists, we know that incentives matter. We have to calculate how much they matter. But a tax like that big for small businesses and pass-through industries is just going to absolutely devastate them.
So when we talked about deficits and spending, I think, kind of came to a conclusion that right now is not the time to be thinking about long-term debt reductions. But what is the strategy to keep entitlements from going bankrupt, given all of the other demands on spending? Kevin, would you like to start?
Yeah. So putting the economist hat on, I think that economists agree that fixing long-run entitlements is essential, and that the appropriate approach to do that is to have a big fiscal consolidation. There's a big literature on fiscal consolidations, and if they're done right, then they can be not harmful for growth, but actually helpful because they give people optimism about the future. But I think that, entitlements require bipartisan action and big fiscal consolidation. And so for economists, it's kind of an easy thing to solve, but for politicians, it's extremely difficult. And it's been really, really a long time since anyone's taken a move at the entitlements.
Yeah, look, I think Kevin and I have talked about this before, that if you look at the data, the debt, the spending as a share of GDP and the taxes as a share of GDP over a long period of time in the United States have been relatively stable. And just aging the population forward implies that either the spending as a share of GDP is going to go up to levels that it's never been before, or that taxes are going to go up. Well, if that goes up, then taxes got to go up to a level they've never been before. Or the other side is you got to go cut what people believe that they are due to receive, that the deal that they had with Social Security or Medicare implied a certain level of entitlement benefits that they were going to get. And so it's got to be one or the other. You either got to pay for the programs that exist now, or you got to cut the programs that exist now. I'm more in favor of at the least doing a lot on the revenue side to maintain what are the most popular programs in the history of the American government. There's no question that if you go ask people, do you think that the way we should solve this problem in Social Security is to raise taxes to maintain the Social Security retirement system we have now, or we should cut the benefits of people who would receive Social Security. There's overwhelming support that we should raise taxes to maintain the retirement with dignity kind of model that we currently have. And so I think Kevin's right. This is mostly a political determination, not an economic determination. But don't count out the fact that big majorities of the voters express that they don't want to cut down entitlements, and they're angry that we would go pull $2 trillion out of the revenue side at the same time that you're saying there's a crisis on the entitlement spending side.
So there's some questions from the audience about the relief payments that increased unemployment insurance benefits. And specifically, some workers are earning more in unemployment benefits than they did at their jobs, and they're opting not to return to work. Is this a real and prevalent issue? Are there ways to minimize this phenomenon while still helping those who need the stimulus benefits the most?
Hey, Austin, let me go on this one.
Okay.
I was in the middle of that. The first, that was before, not now, and so it's not an active matter now. The problem was back in the spring that we were looking at an economy that was being shut down, and say the typical worker makes about $1,000 a week. Their unemployment insurance benefit was about $400 a week, and there was that's an average person, not of course individuals may vary. And it was the intent of everybody, Democrats and Republicans, to sort of find the $600 and get it to folks. The way that we preferred to do it was to just basically get people a benefit that got them back to 100% of their income. But we found that a lot of the states have such old computer systems that their unemployment insurance programs don't have the capability to do that. They can only administer a lump sum. And so in the pandemic, in the emergency, with the economy shut down, we were unable to basically do it the exactly right way, which is to just make people whole. And there were a lot of people, probably more than half of workers, who got more money because they got $600 a week as opposed to just filling the gap in their income. But that problem's not there anymore.
Yeah, look, that's an answer. I didn't know the backstory. I find that totally plausible. You've seen the failures in a bunch of the states' unemployment insurance systems to process through the claims. So I could believe that would be a motivator. I think there are now multiple studies using data from the JP Morgan Chase accounts, as well as administrative data from the UI systems themselves. In the middle of the pandemic COVID recession, where we lost 21 million jobs in a single month, and there were 5 unemployed workers per job available, I found massively overblown the concern that high unemployment insurance was putting a check on the
I agree.
recovery of the job market. And the evidence now backs up that it wasn't. That wasn't a problem. That's like a first world problem. Once you're out of the COVID recession kind of pandemic crisis, for sure you want to think about what are the replacement rates. At a moment when we're in total free fall and we're arguing about, do we think the unemployment rate is going to go to 25% or merely 18%? That's not the moment to be saying people are choosing to be unemployed. They weren't. And if you look at the data, the people coming back, literally 75% of the people who are going back to work are coming back to work at jobs that pay less than the unemployment insurance pays. So the idea that people were en masse not working and the unemployment rate was materially higher because of those payments, I think is not borne out in the data, at least for this period. And as Kevin says, and now it's over. They let that expire.
There's a question also about how to allocate the relief packages in terms of support to individuals versus business loans. What are both of your thoughts on that?
You want me to start on this one?
Sure.
I guess I'm kind of two minds. First, the CARES Act was unbelievably large. And it's actually 4 different things. So we have some loans, if we have some relief to individuals, and we have some relief to business, and we have some relief to big businesses through lending. So we have grants to small business, lending to big business, checks to everyone, and unemployment insurance. Those are kind of the four categories. In Europe, they more geared toward we'll give you grants to keep people on the payroll, kind of like a mega size version of PPP. And for sure, their labor market experience was better. Now, if you think that this health shock is going to be persistent, then that model's got problems, because you're going to have some substantial reallocation. And are you really going to be paying cruise lines to keep all their employees on the ship when nobody's taking a cruise? That said, I think the loans model is implicitly saying we're trying to get business to pay for the safety net, a thing that we normally thought of the government to be the safety net. We're saying to the businesses, hey, we'll lend you money to pay your workers, but you're going to have to pay this money back. And I think that is why you've seen remarkably, notably low take-up of the unbelievably large Fed lending facility to big business. So I guess I kind of, in my heart, am rooting that we steer back to the individuals, helping the individuals, because I don't think that the lending to the corporations channel is really working that well.
I would add a fifth thing, Austin, to the CARES Act, which is payments to hospitals, because that was a huge amount of money as well. I think that Austin's right, that as economists, what we need to do is analyze the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground are that there are a lot of loans still available that people don't demand. And the reason they don't demand them probably is because they're worried that there's not going to be demand for their products, when they get to the other side of this thing, and they're burning cash like crazy right now and wondering, well, does the present value of profits that I make after we turn things back on, is that high enough so that I should continue to lose so much money every month trying to, keep things afloat? A lot of people in DC, probably you even, Austin, when you lived in DC, know about the Capitol Lounge. It's the most famous bar in the city, probably one of the most profitable for the last 20 something years. They just went out of business. They just decided that they don't know when things are going to open up again, and that the negative cash flow, sadly, was such that they just couldn't keep going. I think that what that means is that we have to come up with something, and that this, I agree with Austin, is probably going to be more on the demand side, that lets people know that there's going to be demand for their product. And that people are going to be back out there going to restaurants and to bars and things like that because they're safe and because they have money, and that's the crucial thing going forward. But I think that the second thing is that you need to give people cause for medium and long run optimism. And I think that if you take away the medium and long term optimism by having like this big tax hike on pass-through entities, or the corporate tax hike less so, then you run the risk of causing people to just give up and close up shop now.
All right, well, we're running pretty short on time, and I just want to ask both of you to give a little bit of a closing statement on what the audience should take away. So Kevin, why don't we start with you? What should the audience take away from President Trump's proposed economic policies?
Well, I think that basically, if you look at the record through the end of last year, and again, I encourage you to go look at the census data today, where we had the biggest reduction in poverty since the war on poverty began. We had median household income up $4,900 in just 2 years. The policies of deregulation and prudent tax reform were working. And I think the question is, as we get to the other side, hopefully soon, of the COVID crisis, is what's the best policy to move us ahead back to that place and even beyond? And my view is, just honestly as an economist, that a big tax hike on businesses, a big tax hike on pass-through entities is not the right way to go. I'm not here to advocate for one candidate or another, but I think that the policy differences between the two of them are pretty visible.
And I guess what I'd say is, there is a kind of a philosophical debate of worldviews, where one group says that if you ask where does growth come from, One group says it comes from the absence of government. If we just got rid of regulations and got rid of taxes, then we would grow. And that is, I believe, in the formulation of trickle down. It's like, well, if we cut taxes low enough for very high income pass-throughs or big corporations, they'll bring the money back and that will filter down to everyone. I think that worldview is perhaps best disproven, or that worldview has to explain why you guys are located at Stanford and why Silicon Valley is in the middle of California, which has always been high regulation, high taxes, violating every bit of the code of that world, of that worldview. Why is it there and not in South Dakota or on the island of Vanuatu or someplace where they have very low capital taxation? And the answer is business and innovation goes to California and to Silicon Valley, not because it's cheap, but because they can't afford not to go there. That it is investing in the infrastructure of the country through education, through childcare, through healthcare, and investing in regular people, not steering the tax cuts to the top or to big corporations. In the other worldview, that's where growth comes from. And if you read through the economic plans, I think you will see the Biden plan is about, here's how we help people, here's how we help the middle class. And the Trump economic plan is more like, here's how successful it will be if we let the high income people keep more of their money. And outside the economic sphere, I'll leave to a different day. Is democracy in danger because of some of the other things that have come out of the administration? But just on the economic side, I think the choice is clear.
Well, thank you both for a great event. And thanks to all the audience members for tuning in. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions that came in, but I think we're all much better informed about the candidates' views on these economic policies. And I'm going to turn it back to Mark for a final word.
Thanks, Gopi, and thanks for so expertly steering this substantive discussion of economic policy issues. And I just want to reiterate the thank you to Austan Goolsbee and to Kevin Hassett, both of whom I know are incredibly busy, for making time to share their insights with our audience. And thanks to all of you who tuned in for joining us today. I hope to see you at a future SIEPR event. And with that, I just want to remind you that 7 weeks from today is the election, so make sure to get out and vote. But thank you again, everyone, and hope to see you soon.